In June of 2016, my boyfriend and I hiked the West Coast Trail on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. This video is an overview of the hike and how we got there. I'm not going to be discussing what gear we took. I'll do that in a different video. This video will cover basically how to get to the trail and what the trail was like, how long it took us, and various challenges we faced. I will be showing photos from the trail in the video, so if you want to avoid spoilers, you might want to just listen. I hiked the trail with very few spoilers and really enjoyed not knowing what sorts of things I'd see. Also keep in mind that trail conditions can and will change. Businesses and services may change their schedules or close, so please don't rely solely on my account of my experience for planning your trip. Everyone's experience on the West Coast Trail will be different. The West Coast Trail is a strenuous hike over several days, so please consider carefully before committing to it. First, you have to know that if you want to hike the West Coast Trail, you must reserve a spot and pay for it in advance. Entry to the trail is limited and you must have a permit. Even if you were to sneak on, there are 2 ferries you have to take, and they won't transport you unless you have a permit. My boyfriend reserved our spots in January of 2016. At that time, naturally, we had no idea what the weather would be on the trail during our hiking week. You have to be prepared to accept whatever you get, whether it's 6 days of sun or 6 days of rain. I live in California, USA. To get to the trail, I drove north, mainly along the I-5 highway, up through Oregon and Washington to Port Angeles. I did not rent a car. I drove my own because the plan was to leave it at Bamfield Trailhead for 5 to 7 days, and I didn't want the expense of having a rental car sitting there that long. From Port Angeles, we took a ferry, ran by Black Ball Ferries, to Victoria City on the southern end of Vancouver Island. For a car and 2 people, the ferry cost around $125. Port Angeles' Black Ball Ferry is not the only ferry serving Vancouver Island. There are many other options. We reserved our spot on the ferry ahead of time. When we got off the ferry, we immediately passed through Canada Customs. We were questioned about where we were from, how long we'd stay, and if we had any fresh produce. We did have apples, oranges, and avocados, which I dutifully confessed, but the customs agent let us keep them. There's no telling if you'll have the same experience, and I wouldn't recommend passing through customs with large amounts of produce. Getting through customs was really quick, just a few minutes. We did need our passports. We stayed 2 days in Victoria for sightseeing and then drove to the Bamfield Trailhead. Bamfield is the northern end of the hike, and to get there you have to use a network of gravel and dirt roads. A lot of the roads are logging roads, and they vary greatly in how well maintained they are. We drove to Duncan and then took Highway 18 past Lake Cowichan, passing through the town of Yobo, and then onto the dirt roads to reach Bamfield. But that's a much more confusing way than driving to Port Alberni via Highway 4 and making your way from there. My boyfriend managed to plot the route manually using Google Maps, since Google couldn't find it on its own, but the roads were quite rough on the car and we got lost once. I recommend using the Port Alberni route. We arrived at the Bamfield Trailhead in time to get our orientation and hiking permit. Before entering the trail, you must have both your permit and orientation. In the orientation, you'll learn about current trail and campground conditions, recent spottings of large predators, as well as safety precautions and rules about using ladders, bridges, and cable cars. Some of this information can also be found online, but you need to have the orientation anyway. My boyfriend had reserved a spot for us on the West Coast Trail bus going from Bamfield to Port Renfrew. That's a shuttle that runs to various destinations, mainly the 2 trailheads, to pick up and drop off hikers and their packs. Reservations are strongly recommended because it does fill up. During some parts of the season, the bus only runs on certain days, if I remember rightly. In our case, we took it to the Port Renfrew Trailhead over more dirt roads. I think the bus cost us about $85 each for the one-way trip. If you want to use it, definitely visit the website and read up on it. I hear there's also an ocean ferry that can transport you, and 2 hikers we met were getting transported by seaplane. I don't have any more information on how to reserve either of those methods. About parking at the trailheads. I read some worrying information about cars getting broken into, especially at the Port Renfrew end. For that reason, we left the car at the Bamfield end. Our car did not get broken into. There is some kind of parking lot right at the Port Renfrew trailhead across from the trail office, but I did not investigate it. Supposedly you can also park elsewhere in Port Renfrew. Parking at Bamfield was free. I think the Port Renfrew parking might require paying, but I don't think you have to drive on dirt roads to get there. The trail bus also picks up in Victoria, I think, so you could leave your car there and just use the bus at both ends of the trail. but unless you know someone with space in their driveway, I think you'd have to pay for long-term parking. Of course, you don't have to bring a car if you use other forms of transportation. So we rode the bus to the Port Renfrew trailhead, which is also called the Gordon River Stop. The bus will also take you into the town of Port Renfrew if you want, so be sure you know which stop you want. There's another trail office at the Gordon River Stop where you can get your orientation and permit. We arrived after the office was closed and walked a couple minutes down the road to Pachidat Campground to spend the night. Pachidat Campground is on the beach of the river and has some camps under the trees too. They also have hot showers for a fee and Wi-Fi, also for a fee. Reserving a site there was a little tricky as I don't respond to emails or Facebook messages very reliably. The best way to get a reservation is to phone them directly. The campground is closed for the winter season. When I stayed at the campground, it was mostly empty. I think being there during the week, not weekend, had something to do with that. I think even if you don't have a reservation, you can walk in and camp in a sort of overflow group area under the trees near the entrance, but I'm not positive. There was also a little restaurant across the street from it, but I didn't go there, and they do close around 5 p.m. or something. We got rained on that night, but the rain had stopped by morning. We walked to the ferry, which is directly beside the trail office, to catch the first ferry of the day, which you can't catch unless you've already had your orientation and received your permit. I think the first ferry was at 8:45 a.m. The first orientation was at 10 a.m., and the next ferry was 11 a.m., or 11:45. The ferry is free with your permit. It's a small metal boat with the capacity for maybe a dozen hikers, and it's a short ride across the river to the trailhead. When we took it, we rode with just a few other hikers. And there began the hike. The trail is 75 kilometers, or 46.6 miles. I'll be giving all the distances in kilometers. Since we began at the south end of the trail, we started with kilometer marker 75, which counted down as we hiked. We also hiked the inland route whenever it was possible, which was a bit more difficult than beach walking, but also more beautiful, we thought. Immediately from the beach where the ferry drops you, there's a ladder, the first of many. The ladders are in varying degrees of repair and age. Some are missing a few rungs, but I never felt that any of them were so rotten they were unsafe. Some of the ladders are also not very vertical, so you'll want some upper body strength to allow you to crawl along them. Our first day, we passed Thrasher Cove Campground without going to look at it and hiked all the way to Campers Creek, which was at approximately the 62-kilometer mark, 13 kilometers in. We made about 1 kilometer an hour speed at some points and managed a bit faster at others. Other hikers were faster than us and a few were slower. Luckily, we got an early start, and the days were long, with sunset not until 9 p.m. or later. The trail was very rough, lots of roots, mud, ladders, bridges, climbing up and down inclines. Getting to Campers Creek the first day, I think, is only possible if you're excellent hikers and/or you take the first ferry of the day. A lot of people stop at Thrasher Cove Camp instead. We were the last to arrive at the camp, and all the good spots were gone. We crossed the creek to camp, but that put the creek between us and the outhouse and bear box. You must protect your food at every place you camp. All the campgrounds have bear boxes, but if for any reason you can't use them, you must string your food and toiletries and anything else smelly up in a tree. All the campgrounds are right beside the beach. Most have a few camping spots just under the edge of the trees, but those are often near the outhouse and thus are rather smelly. Except in an emergency, you are not allowed to camp anywhere except in the designated campgrounds. You are allowed to burn driftwood for a fire, and I recommend it both for psychological reasons and practical reasons. A fire is comforting and warm after a long day hiking. Also, if you want to wash clothing or yourself, a fire will help with drying off. The outhouses are composting outhouses. You enter on the second floor via ladder or stairs. You toss in some cedar shavings with each use. They did not have toilet paper, although one of the rangers suggested that they should. I recommend you bring your own toilet paper. Try to get a kind that decomposes easily. The brands labeled as safe for septic systems are probably best. So we camped at Campers Creek, 62 kilometers in for our first night. That was also the first time we used a cable car right before the camp. When I first heard there were cable cars, I was envisioning something tourists use to go up mountains, but the cable cars on the trail are big enough for only 2 people and their packs, are not enclosed, and are completely human-powered. One cable car is also restricted to 1 person at a time because if 2 people go, it's too heavy to pull up to the far side of the creek. You make the cable cars work by pulling on a rope, hand over hand. You'll probably have to pull the rope to fetch the car from the middle of the cable first. Then, if there are two of you, one person holds the rope to keep the car at the station while the other person gets in. Then, the person in the car holds the rope while the second person gets in. Then, you let go of the rope, and gravity takes the car speedily to the middle of the cable again. From there, you pull the rope hand over hand until you reach the other station. Cable cars do require some arm strength and in most cases cannot be easily bypassed, although we did bypass the one at Q-Light Cove by fording part of the river and using a bit of bridge for the other part. Our second day we hiked to Walbran Creek to camp, although we were very tempted to stop at Q-Light Cove because we were so tired and sore. Walbran is 53 kilometers in, so we hiked 11 kilometers our second day. Q-Light is 58 kilometers in. At the time we were hiking, we were told in our orientation that a winter storm had washed away most of the Q-Light campsite, but we met other hikers who had camped there. There just wasn't much room, they said. The trail got a little easier from campers to Walbran, but not by much. We began to see more stretches of level boardwalk, but there were still plenty of mud pits. From campers to Walbran, there is no option but to take the inland route. At Walbran, we got a nice camping spot under the trees that did not smell of outhouse. By this point, we hadn't experienced much rain, only a little sprinkle from time to time. We made a driftwood fire on the beach and washed up. Fires are only allowed on the beach. For day 3 of hiking, we hiked as far as Cribbs Creek, which was at about 41 kilometers in, making our third day a distance of 12 kilometers. The first section after Walbran, there's the option to go inland or along the beach. We went inland but found the trail to be rather overgrown. We still pushed through, but it seemed less popular than the beach. Then, at the 51-kilometer mark, all hikers are forced to the beach. There are several points where the beach is impassable at high tides, but most of them can be bypassed with the inland route, and we never had a problem. When we were hiking, the low tide was late afternoon and early morning, and high tide was around sunset and mid-morning. I should mention that there is a section near the southern end, from Thrasher Cove at the 70-kilometer mark to the 66-kilometer mark, where a point is impassable at tides about 1.8 meters. The draw to that spot, however, are sea caves that some people want to see. It's a difficult route with surge channels and boulders, but some people make the trek anyway. My boyfriend and I went inland instead. Getting back to our day 3, we spent most of the day walking along the beach to Cribbs Creek. We passed a restaurant where you can buy burgers at around the 45-kilometer mark. At 44 kilometers is Carmana Lighthouse, which is a nice detour. When I was there, in the garden was a huge fuchsia bush with lots of hummingbirds. I'll also mention that of all the campsites we saw, Vanilla Point at 48 kilometers was the prettiest in my opinion. During the beach route, we had to cross several streams coming down to the ocean, but in the weeks before our hike there had been little rain and the creeks were low and easy to get across. I did bring sandals and switched into them a couple times to make the crossing easier. In some places we could balance on rocks or use logs, and in one place the creek was small enough to just jump over. Cribbs Creek Campground at 42 kilometers was crowded. Almost everyone stops there because after Cribbs, the next campground is Tsusiat Falls at 25 kilometers, and there is no fresh water until nearly that point. There are comfort cabins at the 30-kilometer mark, run by a First Nations reservation. I overheard that a comfort cabin can hold 4 people on 4 cots and costs $90 to rent. Split between 4 people, it might be worth it. I did not investigate further. Day 4 gives some inland and beach walking options, but we took all the inland options we could. You also must cross via another ferry during this stretch at Nitinat Narrows, kilometer 32. Your permit will get you across, and there is no schedule of departures when we were there. Just cross when you're ready. Let the operators know. Although the map says crossing is only possible from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. I don't know if the operators actually do go home at 4:30 and crossing becomes impossible until they return the next day. There's another restaurant there, where you can get crab and other seafood meals or a unique t-shirt that they claim is only sold there. We made it to Tsusiat Falls Campground, 25 kilometers, feeling very sore and tired, but wondering if we should push on to Klanawa River Campground at 23 kilometers. We decided to stay and descended ladders to the beach. There is a waterfall there, but I don't recommend it for camping if you can avoid it. The outhouse was way down the beach, and the bear box hidden under a few trees in a different location. It was also very crowded, with both people and driftwood, and we couldn't find any camps under the trees. I recommend pushing on to Klanawa River Camp if you have the energy for it. We had time to bathe, make a fire, and set up our tent, but we could see the rain clouds coming. That night we got rained on hard. It was still raining in the morning, and we tried to pack up, staying as dry and warm as we could, but we got really cold and couldn't start a fire because all the wood was wet. It made for a difficult start that day. Luckily, our tent had a vestibule where we stashed all our equipment, so things stayed mostly dry. The rain broke just as we were finishing getting ready to hike. Day 5 involved both inland and beach walking, and the hiking was getting easier, although there were still mud pits. We hiked to Darling River that day, at 14 kilometers, making it an 11-kilometer day. Darling River has a larger waterfall than Tsusiat. Even if you don't camp there, be sure to detour to go see it, as it's very lovely, and if the weather is warm, would make a lovely swimming spot. Most of the campsites are on the beach. The ones under the trees smell of outhouse. We managed to dry the stuff that we'd packed wet that morning, and it didn't rain much that night, only a sprinkle. We planned to finish our hike the next day, going 14 kilometers to the Bamfield trailhead. The trail was much easier now, and we made good time. We paused at the Pachina Lighthouse, which is another nice little detour. It's also worth it to go see the Sea Lion Haul-Out Rock at 9 kilometers. When we went past, there were dozens of sea lions on it. If you have binoculars or a good zoom on your camera, it's a great spot. There's not much else to mention as far as the trail out. It's mostly flat and wide and easy to walk. There are some beautiful spots where bridges cross over gushing streams and small waterfalls. The last kilometer gives the option of beach or inland. We took the inland and encountered the last of the ladders. Then we arrived at the Bamfield office, had our picture taken on the porch of it, and went to see about the car. It was where we left it and had not been broken into. We'd made sure to leave a few gallon jugs of water in the car. We also had a few other food options in there, and other shoes and changes of clothing. We drove to Nanaimo that night and found lodging at a little hostel. Setting up reservations for after the hike was difficult because we didn't know how long we would take. We took the ferry operated by BC Ferries out of Nanaimo the next day, arriving in Vancouver City on the mainland, and then drove down and crossed back into the U.S. We'd gotten reservations for the first ferry from Port Angeles to Victoria, but there was a fee for reserving the Nanaimo ferry, so we just showed up about an hour before departure and didn't have trouble getting a spot on the ferry. Counting the night at Pachidat Campground in Port Renfrew, we took 6 nights and 6 days of hiking, doing on average about 12 kilometers a day. Most people make it in 5 to 7 days. The way most of the campgrounds are spaced out, they're around 4 to 6 kilometers apart, so you're often forced into either long days or short days, not medium. And then there's the big gap between Cribbs Creek and Tsusiat Falls Campground, which you have to arrange to hike in one day. If you hike north to south instead, note that you have to take the Gordon River ferry at the very end. The map says the last ferry is at 3:30 p.m., so if you miss it, you'll be camping impromptu on the scrap of beach at the trailhead. There are benefits to going each way. The harder trails are from 50 to 75 kilometers at the south end. You can do these when you're fresh by starting at the south and getting them over with, but you'll be carrying more food and so have heavier packs. Starting at the north and going south, your packs will be lighter by then, and maybe your legs will be stronger and you'll be more skilled, but you also might be sore and injured. I got blisters despite using anti-blister socks, and my boyfriend hurt his knee and ribs by slipping on a root and falling. We both slipped many times. Everything is slippery and muddy. We were hiking after a relative dry spell, but if you end up doing it when there's more rain, it will be even wetter and muddier than you've seen here. In another video, I talk about what gear I took, and if I recommend what I took, so check that out if you're curious. I hope this helped give you an idea of what the West Coast Trail is like, at least my experience on it. Feel free to leave questions below, and if I can, I'll try to answer them, or maybe leave comments about other experiences you've had, help other people who are looking for information about the trail. Thanks, and happy trails!